Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. This week, bringing you a special American Probation and Parole Association edition. As the voice of the community corrections industry, APPA serves as the field's leading professional membership association. In addition to their U.S. members, the American Probation and Parole Association is supported by international members who are actively involved in strengthening community corrections work in their own countries. APPA's International Relations Committee aims to connect community corrections professionals around the world to inspire and share insights from their unique experiences and best practices. Welcome to this special APPA episode of The Criminologist. And now, welcome your host, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello and welcome to episode 139 of the Criminologist podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. This week, bringing you yet another special hybrid edition as we are teaming up with our good friends at the American Probation and Parole Association, in particular, their International Relations Committee. We have been dropping in these special hybrid editions about once a month, again, trying to highlight some of the great work of APPA in an attempt to show that APPA's influence really extends beyond the United States, and they have a great international presence as well. This week, we're going to be going north of the border to Canada to talk with Simon Bonk of Telio. Simon's going to tell us some amazing things they're doing up there with technology in particular. Now, for those of you who may not be aware of the American Probation and Parole Association, allow me to bring you some brief contextual information before I share my conversation with Simon Bonk. The American Probation and Parole Association really is the voice of the community corrections industry. APPA serves as the field's leading professional membership association. Their work is supported by thousands of passionate members throughout the United States and beyond. So if you are one of my many international listeners, please know that the American Probation and Parole Association welcomes your views, your input, and indeed your membership. Now, APPA has members at all levels of the government and the private sector, including community corrections professionals, service providers, libraries and educators, research students, volunteers, concerned citizens, corporations, public policy advocates, and others with an interest in criminal and juvenile justice. Everything that the American Probation and Parole Association does is aimed at reducing recidivism to keep our communities safe. And that means strengthening the role of the community corrections industry. Now, prior to the founding of APPA, community corrections professionals had no collective voice. Having no national representation fighting for best practices and policies in the field inspired some of America's most distinguished correctional administrators to act. And so, what does that look like today? Well, from the perspective of the field, there are research reports, guides, webinars, web-based products and services. You can check out Perspectives magazine or continue to listen to this podcast where we will be bringing you special guests from American Probation and Parole Association. As a professional, you can take advantage of their many training institutes, of which I will be talking about their multiple winter training institutes at the conclusion of this interview. They also have an awesome leadership institute, lots of on-site trainings, as well as online trainings. And from the perspective of best practices, APPA continues to advocate for evidence-based practices and policies in the field. They organize committees, they host issue-specific workshops and groups, and of course, lead focus groups to keep APPA on the cutting edge of best practices in the field of corrections. Now let's get to this week's very special guest, Simon Bonk, joining us all the way from Ottawa, Canada. Simon is the Chief Research Officer and Director of Business Development at Telio. Simon is a brilliant man. I'm going to let him tell you all about himself because, frankly, I won't do it justice. But please enjoy my conversation with Simon Bonk, joining us all the way from Ottawa. And I will see you all on the other side. Well, welcome to the show, Simon. Simon, you have such a unique background and, dare I say, non-traditional resume vis-a-vis many of the other members of the American Probation and Parole Association. So I'm going to let you introduce yourselves to our audience, and then we will have a conversation around technology and how we can better leverage technology for our correctional stakeholders. So take it away, Simon, and tell our audience all about yourself and some of your career milestones up to this point.
Yeah, thanks, Joe, and thanks for the opportunity. I'm really looking forward to this chat and sharing some experiences with the audience and extend the conversation that we've been having at APPA and other venues. So I'm Simon Bonk. I'm currently the Chief Research Officer, and Director of New Business Development at Telio. But I spent the vast majority of my career in the Canadian Public Service. I just recently, in fact, joined Telio this past February. I worked in 3 large operational departments within the Canadian Public Service. I started my career in tax, basically the Canadian version of the IRS. Spent a good 15 years there. Part of one of my jobs that I had was knocking on doors and collecting taxes. So I got some great stories there. Then I moved into to border services, and then finally I became the CIO at the Correctional Service of Canada. And I held a bunch of different roles. I started out like I said, in tax, answering tax questions during filing season. Moved into financial management, strategic management. I headed up some functional and operational programs. I was the Deputy Chief Financial Officer at Border Services, basically the Canadian version of Homeland Security. And then, as I said, I was the CIO. So I didn't necessarily come into corrections naturally, and my background isn't technology by any stretch. I did work for the CIO at the Border Services for a couple years, but my educational background is economics and accounting. And so moving into corrections wasn't necessarily planned. Moving into technology wasn't necessarily planned. So kind of a unique perspective and where I ended up.
Simon, I want to get to your great work at Telio in a minute here, but you mentioned the Correctional Service of Canada. I'm familiar with CSC, but a lot of our American listeners who look at corrections through their lens of our government delivery systems, whether they're county or state, may not be. Can you maybe just give some context to CSC for our listeners?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, maybe I can fit it into the justice continuum within Canada. So, unlike the United States, Canada basically has 2 levels of correctional jurisdictions. We have the federal system, which is Correctional Service of Canada, which would equate to the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and then we have the provincial prisons and correctional systems. And the big difference, frankly, is, and it's a little bit different than in the United States, the big difference is that in the federal system, in the Correctional Service of Canada, we take all inmates who are convicted of a crime and their sentence is greater than 2 years. So we don't have remand or anything like that in the federal system. It's simply those that have been convicted of a crime. And it's not like a federal or provincial crime. It's just of a crime in Canada, and the sentence is greater than 2 years in an institution. And then the provinces have those individuals that are convicted of a crime, and their sentence is less than 2 years, or they also have remand.
Okay, so almost, and it's probably a crude analogy, but when we think of down here in the United States, I should say, misdemeanors, gross misdemeanors, punishable by up to a year, felonies beyond. There's sort of that demarcation at the 2-year mark is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, exactly. It could be for, you could have somebody in the federal system convicted of a crime, and it could be the same crime as somebody that was convicted in the provincial system. It's just the length of sentence.
Okay, yeah. I love learning about comparative systems of justice, so I'm always intrigued by what other nations are doing in their correctional delivery systems. We touched on it a little bit earlier. You are currently Chief Research Officer and Director of Business Development at Telio. Tell our listeners all about Telio and the great work they do.
Yeah, it's an interesting how I came to get to Telio. I left the Canadian Public Service after almost 30 years this past February. I'm the first and only North American employee for Telio right now, as we look to maybe enter the North American market. But it was interesting as I was starting to look at what options were available to me when I was thinking about making a transition from public service. I had a couple calls, and one of the calls was with our CEO Oliver Drews. And one of the things that really struck me about Telio, and maybe it's because of the link to my public service, where I think in government we measure outcomes. Our bottom line is societal gains, right? Making our country, our state, our county better. And it's not necessarily a profit-oriented view compared to the private sector. But one of the things that I had been working on at CSC was, and this is just one little example of stuff I was working on, but you know how they have kind of green procurement, and when governments put out tenders now, you get a few extra bonus points, if I can put it that way, for green procurement. And I was starting to think about, could we do the same thing in the correctional space when we're going out for contracts with for our partners? And one of the things I thought, well, can we have kind of a give back clause within our procurement? And the reason I share this with you is because one of the conversations that really struck me when I started talking to our CEO about the opportunity, he had just recently stood up a foundation that provides aid for children of incarcerated individuals. And I thought, that really resonated with me. It really resonated with the fact that Telio wasn't just about the services that they sell, but they actually wanted to contribute to a better world, and not to be too hokey, but they wanted to make a difference. And so that was one of the things that really resonated with me. And and then started talking, and it was an organization that was really family oriented, and a lot of times that's just talk, right? You have these organizations, including government, frankly, that they talk about values and ethics and all that good stuff, and promoting mental health and things of that nature. But sometimes it strikes me that and in government, I know there's a probity of taxpayer dollars, so that maybe they can't do as much as they would like. But one of the things that after I joined Telio that really reinforced the fact that that they really want to be a family is we're a global company, and we have we're in Australia, we're in Africa, we're in Europe, we're in the UAE, and they had a barbecue, and it's like, okay, that's nice. Glad you're having the barbecue. I'll talk to you when it's over, type thing. And no, we want you there. And when I was talking to Telio, that really came through, and this just reinforced that they're really committed not just to what they do, but to the people that they work with that make it all happen. And again, maybe that had a bigger impact than it should have, but the fact that they said, come to Hamburg, Germany, that's where our headquarters are, for this barbecue. It was on the weekend. It's like, come on over, just, and I was like, okay, I don't think I want to fly all the way to Hamburg just for the barbecue, but we have offices in Hamburg and Amsterdam and different locations. So I took the opportunity to work there, but just, I think it reflects what we're about as an organization. And yes, obviously we're a business, and we have to be cognizant of the bottom line, but really what I think we're about, and I don't think it's just me, I think it's what we represent is, we understand that we can make a contribution to making the lives of incarcerated and their families better. We understand that, this can have a trickle-down effect and make a difference beyond just the walls of the prison. And, that's what we do. And we do it in a way that, it's not a big organization. We're Telio's maybe about 300 people, maybe a little bit less, in fact. But it's a family, and that's really what Telio is about. I could go on about all the services that we provide and the how we do it and all that good stuff. But really, to me, Telio is really about making the world a better place. And then, I think we all understand that if we do our jobs well, the bottom line will be more than healthy.
I love that notion when you talked about that give back clause, and looking for partnerships which have more of that. What's the word I'm looking for? Not humanitarian, but sort of egalitarian spirit to them. I know you're a little bit reticent to go down that rabbit hole, but what are some of the deliverables that Telio is out there pushing? Is it in the arena, for example, Simon, of smart prisons? I know that's becoming kind of a catchphrase now, but is that the type of thing that people might see Telio involved with?
Yeah, that's absolutely it. So, we focus on telecommunications, video communications for inmates and their families. We also provide digital services, so that includes entertainment, automated processes within the institution, messaging, law libraries, basically virtual education programs. We're actually having some conversations right now with the jurisdiction about how we can live stream some university level courses to Indigenous women, and we'll see if it comes off or not. But in the cell, and also some of our infrastructure is a little bit unique as well. I'm sure you're well aware of all the tablets and things of that nature. But we have some technology that allows us to leverage coax cable, so that you don't have to make significant investments into your infrastructure and still have some of those digital services. So it's things like that. We also do a little bit of detection and jamming for cell phones, and just depending on the jurisdiction you're in, you can jam and not just detect. We also get into we have some partnerships with drone detection or contraband detection and things of that nature. So we have a fairly broad service base, but really it's about advancing that smart prison, that digital prison. And again, it's not just about the inmates, it's not just about their families, but it's also for the institutions themselves, and making them a better place. And we all understand right now some of the challenges around staffing and HR, and if we can help to enable the officers to be able to focus on those higher value services in the institution, as opposed to focusing on some of the administrative tactical tasks, I think that that adds a lot of value as well.
Could not agree more. I am of the belief that the recent pandemic really pushed a lot of entities, but in corrections, it really pushed us into how we do our business, and now we're sort of had to fast forward to a lot of those technologies. Where do you see technology and that synergy with corrections moving forward, now that we've again gotten some pretty good ideas that we're forced to come up with during the pandemic?
Yeah, and your observation around what COVID was able to accelerate, I don't think can be understated in all aspects of the whole justice continuum. It was really almost like a 2-year pilot or proof of concept, and it really, there was things that I was able to accomplish in 2 years. Like, COVID was a tragic event, globally. A lot of people lost their lives. Who would have thought that we would be, isolated in our homes for, 12 months or more with, limited ability to go out and even go shopping. It was tragic. But it was also, if there was a silver lining, at least in the correctional space, we were able to accelerate a whole bunch of stuff. And not just accelerate the implementation, but also demonstrate, what technology was capable of. Just some silly examples. At the time, I was in the role as CIO at CSC, and just like being able to increase the bandwidth. I tried for years. Like, we had some, Canada's a big country. Our institutions are spread out all over the country in more mid-sized to smaller communities. We had sites, and I don't think I'm telling tales out of school here. We had sites that had, when I first arrived about 7 years ago, we had sites that had less bandwidth than your home. And when we started to, rapidly increase the amount of video visitation, just as one example, we had to just, it had to scale. And there's a cost to that, obviously, as well. But, just that alone, just COVID alone allowed us to improve the infrastructure. But to go back to your question about, technology, it's interesting because I'm not convinced that technology is the challenge to modernizing corrections. And I actually think that the tech piece of it is probably the easier bit in terms of what we could do or and how we do it. I think that the bigger challenge is the ability for business to reimagine itself, to modernize itself, and then tech can deliver that, and I think it can also inspire that. So I think technology's role going forward is really about how to inspire the business to do things differently. I'm a big believer in that, change should be business-led in partnership with technology. But I don't think that's the real challenge as it related to modernization and technology. But some of the things that I think where I could see, technology starting to inspire change and transformation. And then frankly, I don't even think we have to be that creative. I think we can just beg, borrow, and steal from other sectors. For example, in the health industry, in hospitals, they're using Bluetooth technology and sensors to, as one example, to see if somebody had fallen out of bed and maybe have injured themselves. I think we could import that into an institution, and instead of having maybe people fall out of their bed, but maybe we could use it to detect when people might be above their bed and maybe have engaged in self-harm. We just have to import that. Another example could be, we use a lot of monitoring devices for those in the community. People are now starting a little bit to, incorporate, cell phones and different things in there. But what about if we start to extend some of the cell phone, not from a monitoring perspective, but actually to be a tool to facilitate rehabilitation, and not just for the offender? What about their family? And, really improve the conditions for success. Another example would be, I think AI is going to be a game changer. And I do think we have to guard against some of the bias that could be built in, and we have to be cognizant of that. But I think we can overcome it. I have some colleagues that are working on with the Council of Europe on developing some guidelines and I don't want to call them rules, but some suggestions for how to implement AI. But I had a demonstration from an AI company again when I was back at CSC, and it was at a major department store. And what they were trying to do, and obviously they have a lot of cameras there to prevent shoplifting and things of that nature. So they had this data, and I think data, the opportunity with data, we could go on for hours there. But the idea of this shopping center was to leverage their cameras and start to determine when people would be coming to the checkout. And because they didn't want to have big lines. Yes, we have, you have the self-service checkouts today, but what they were trying to do is being able to adjust in real time and anticipate when people were going to be checking out, and then adjust their staff levels at the cash. And they would look at things like, okay, somebody came in with their kids. They use AI to start to learn about the interactions, and somebody comes in with their kids, they're probably getting what they need and getting out. Somebody that maybe is coming in, and let's say it was like a Lowe's or something like that, and the gentleman comes in his work boots, and maybe he's going to take a little bit longer to take a look at stuff. But they developed algorithms on pattern recognition that would get them to go to cash. Tell me we couldn't import that into an institution where we've got cameras all over the place, and let's say you and I are having a conversation, and every time you and I have a conversation, there's an incident. If we can start to look at this in a bit of a predictive way, we don't have to go and intervene. We could just send an officer in that space to say, just to have a presence. That might be enough to dissuade, and then we avoid unpleasantness. And so I think that there's a lot of application, but again, really, I don't think that the real challenge is technology. I think it rests elsewhere.
I love when you began that conversation and you used the analogy of the illustration rather of monitoring. But I agree with you that it's more about shifting the spirit, if you will, of why we're using that technology. For example, I'm old enough to remember when we first rolled out electronic monitoring, and it was the old, even before radio frequency, when it was the old telephone random calling. But my point is, we were always using technology to surveil and contain. We need to spin that around, as you alluded to, and say, well, how can we use technology more as a reintegration tool, more as a rehabilitation tool, and not simply use it as, well, this is a fancy way to create another jail cell in the community. And again, your thoughts on the AI are the exact same. Use it for the benefit of the justice involved individual to excel, and not strictly as another high-tech surveillance or containment measure.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, I don't know what the exact stats are, and they probably vary a little bit by jurisdiction. But the reality is the folks that are incarcerated, probably somewhere between 80 and 90% return to society.
Yep.
So how do we enable them to have a positive return to wherever they're going to call home? And I really think that, sure, can technology help with, the punitive side of incarceration? Sure. But, we talk about the idea of normalcy, and how does technology start to play a role there in facilitating the notion of normalcy? Again, so when these folks return to the community, they're set up for success. How do we, put technology in their hands so they're comfortable with it? How do we leverage technology to better educate folks? Even from a perspective of how do we use technology? It's funny. I was talking with a colleague. He's actually the CIO of Sweden, Håkan Claron, and he was talking about the idea of tech in the role of democracy, and for the incarcerated individual, for the individual in the community. And I thought, that's brilliant. But I think, a lot of times we think, and for sure, there's technology can really play a part in making prisons and the community more efficient and effective. The grievance process is a prime example in Canada. If you file a grievance inside the institution, it's a 3-page carbon-loaded document that the inmate fills out and sends. And you have litigious, or I don't know what the equivalent would be for grievances, but you have those folks that are serial grievers. And I remember seeing my boss, because I reported to the number 2 individual at corrections, taking literally suitcases of grievances home to review. And I got to think that AI could take a look at some of those, say, this grievance is a 98% match to the last 10 grievances we've got on the same topic. Doesn't decide, but recommends that it is a 98% match, and perhaps it should be denied or approved. Either way, it doesn't matter. But just to make the process more efficient, automate the process. And I think you can leapfrog. Right now it's paper based. Yes, you could automate it, but I think if you were to jump to say something like AI, now you've modernized. You've jumped right over automation. And I think there's a whole bunch of administrative type tasks that technology could lend itself to. But I think the real benefit of technology is, the rehabilitative process. And and I think that extends beyond the incarcerated individual or the person in the community, but, to their ecosystem. And I think that's where the real opportunity lies, because, we talk about how much the average cost of an inmate is. And, in Canada, it's probably just over $100,000. But that doesn't take into the equation the cost within the public safety or the justice continuum, right? So when you start to add that all up together, somebody said the other day, it might be $1 million per incarceration. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but the point being is a lot more than just the cost to have somebody incarcerated. So let's think about the opportunity in those terms, and not just the justice. And you can even go beyond the justice continuum. I think if you start to bring in the societal continuum, the cost of having people break the law and how we handle it today, I think technology can make a big difference.
Yeah, we often talk about how when individuals are released from incarceration, we have all of these societal roadblocks set up which actually work counterintuitively to help them reintegrate. Things like housing prohibitions or employment prohibitions. But to your point, Simon, we should be able to use technology to leverage technology rather to make that reintegration a much more seamless and cost efficient process. Hey, I want to change gears just a little bit. I know that you are active with ICPA, the International Corrections and Prison Association. Share some of those experiences with our listeners and/or a little bit about what ICPA is about for our listeners who are unfamiliar with that organization.
Yeah, and, I probably have to thank ICPA for, indirectly for being able to have this conversation with you today. ICPA is, as you mentioned, is the International Association for Corrections and Prisons, and it's global. Actually, we just had our conference, the first one since the COVID reality in Orlando, just this past November, and it brings together leaders of around the world in conversation at this conference and different discussions. But also part of that is there's a number of working groups. I in fact chair the technology network at ICPA, but there's a research network. There's a planning and design network. There's an oversight network as well, where in Canada we have the Office of the Correctional Investigator, who is kind of like, I'll call it the watchdog over the Federal Bureau in Canada, and there's a number of others, and we get together on a regular basis, and actually there's a webinar coming up later this week, next week, about the technology space. But there's other events. There's a research symposium, as an example, in I think March of next year. There's a technology symposium in next May. And really it's about bringing together all aspects of corrections and starting to have engagement and conversations and share best practices, develop standards across the corrections continuum. And great organization. I've been a part of it now for, I think I really got introduced to it in probably 7 years ago in Romania. And really what it's allowed me to do is to develop a network of like-minded individuals where we can have conversations. It's funny, I was talking to one of my colleagues, and we used to get together and just have ad hoc conversations, all coming out of ICPA. That was a common connection, and they were almost like therapy sessions for us. And the one thing that I discovered is that we have a lot more in common than I think sometimes we would like to admit. Around the world, I think a lot of times we propose that we're unique. There's a certain specialty to what we do in each of our jurisdictions, and certainly that exists. But I think that we have a lot more in common. I think it's it's something that we can really build on. And it's one of the things that I've been trying to promote through the tech network is how do we work together and break down some of the traditional silos and barriers between, say, academia and research, not-for-profits, the jurisdictions themselves, and the vendors as well. Now that I'm on I have a colleague who said, now you're on the dark side. You're out of public service. But I think organizations such as ICPA, APPA, CTA, there's a multitude of them. If we start to break down some of these traditional roles and narratives, and if we can start to partner, I think we'll all benefit. And I like to think that's what ICPA tries to bring those different parties together and facilitate a conversation.
Yeah, I could not agree more. I've been blessed to be involved with some international work the last year or so. And to your point, the more we see differences, but we see those commonalities as well. And that's really heartwarming. So in previous discussions, Simon, you've shared your vision for elevating the, quote, benefit narrative. Can you elaborate on that philosophy, if you would?
Yeah, and I think to some extent this was born out of necessity in my previous role. And, the one thing, I often describe myself as a big puddle. I'm pretty wide, but I'm not very deep, which is probably a little bit, at least my experience is maybe a little bit unique in government, because I think a lot of times people get into a business line and they stay in that business line, particularly in corrections. It amazed me the years of service my colleagues had at CSC. They start there, they never left. And there's good and bad about that, right? There's pluses and minuses to that. But the one thing that I was fortunate enough, and and it was in different roles, chief among them when I was a deputy chief financial officer for border services. Our budget was $3 billion. It was a big organization. Border services is kind of the nexus of the universe between security and economic facilitation. You learn how to tell a narrative to the Treasury Department, who control the purse strings. And the one thing that struck me often about corrections is that if we want to get greater investment, we've got to tell our story different. And so the people that are making the financial investment decisions, to be quite frank, and this is my own personal opinion, so feel free to disagree with me, but the folks that are making the financial decisions and our political masters aren't going to get reelected on recidivism and good rehabilitation. Those are good outputs, I would term them. What's going to resonate are those government priorities, things like racial equality, Indigenous reconciliation, economic benefit. And I don't think we do a very good job of making the link, the empirical link, between good correctional outputs like recidivism and rehabilitation to how that's impacting on racial equality or some of the other societal outcomes. And I really think that I started to, as we were trying to build the business case, frankly, to try to garner investment, I really started to explore that. And there isn't a whole lot of research out there. At least I didn't uncover it. And I shouldn't say I was fortunate enough to have some folks that were much smarter than I and look in the right places. But there was no real research that could make that link between the two. And I think it's a compelling narrative. And recently, in the last two editions there's a publication called Justice Trends. And my last article in my previous role, we floated this notion of societal gain stemming from good corrections. And in the last edition, I went a little bit deeper and explored the idea and put forth the hypothesis that good educational programming in an institution actually starts to break the cycle of incarceration and impacts the inmate's ecosystem. And again, some of this I would term it circumstantial evidence, but the article basically explores three elements about education and basically the impact of having an incarcerated individual, say, on the family unit. And I uncovered some studies where if there's a single parent, what that does to the success of a child in a community. If the parent is incarcerated, the impact that has on their educational results, and not to mention just being able to embrace education within the institution. Where I end up is that education can actually start to not just make the situation and the outlook for the incarcerated individual better, but also for their family members, and that their children will be perhaps better advantaged if that person comes back into the home with a new appreciation of education and some college diplomas or even college courses. And of course, it also sets them better from an economic perspective and their job prospects. But really, it's around elevating the narrative so that it resonates with the decision makers and elevates what corrections does. I think we all know that, but it's telling the story differently.
Yeah, we definitely need a better public relations bureau, if you will, in corrections. To your point, I know I've often asked myself, what legislator is going to get up there and stake their career on? We need to take a different stance on violent offenders or sex offenders or domestic violence offenders, which follows the science. Because again, it's not good. It's not a good winning theme. What is on the horizon for Simon Bonk? Simon, look into your crystal ball. When I have you back on the show in a year or two, what do you envision that we might be talking about at that time?
Good question. One of the things that I've been talking a little bit about lately is, 10 years ago, what were we talking about in within the correctional space, right? And what are we talking about today? And, a lot of it, we mentioned it earlier, we have electronic monitoring and there's been an evolution in there, but it's largely probably about the same. There's been a lot of talk about digital services, tablets, things of that nature. They've been around for a long time. What I'd love to, in a year or two, what are we influencing for the next 10 years? What's going to be the thing that we're going to talk about in the next 10 years? And hopefully have a bit of an ability to influence that. And the other thing, frankly, it was just what we're talking about. I've started to do some work with some folks in academia and in other corners of our sector about how do we empower jurisdictions to change. And I'm of the belief that if we can start to develop a business case, develop the narrative, it links to that societal outcomes that we were just talking about. But with Telio, I'm of the view that if we can start to partner, and I'm blessed that Telio is giving me the flexibility to do this. But if we can start to partner with academia and research and other vendors and jurisdictions to basically create the quintessential business case that every jurisdiction could go and say, here's the business case, invest in us. I think that benefits everybody. I think that, from a Telio perspective, we hopefully we'd be seen as a different partner, a different vendor partner than, what's perhaps typically seen, that because if we're going to benefit when the jurisdictions benefit. And if we can develop that business case that, empowers jurisdictions to get that investment, then we're all going to be better off. And I think starting to think about the change narrative and how we can, does corrections need a nuanced change approach? And I've been reading some studies recently, and one was I forget where it was from. It was from the United States, but I forget which state. But it talked about, they did a bit of a survey of the staff, and one of the thoughts was around, the leadership and around change. And one of the things that strikes me about the correctional space is that it's really operational and it's crisis management. And what I'd really like to be able to do is try to continue to influence how we can make space for change, how we can, and I think that starts with changing how we think about corrections and how can we be a little bit more strategic, because I think we become it's crisis du jour and everybody focuses on that crisis du jour, whatever that might be, and it doesn't allow the organizations to be strategic. So I'm hoping that I can start to maybe develop some thinking that will start to advance the idea of a nuanced change approach for corrections. And I'm of the view that that's going to make my organization Telio differentiate itself in terms of the partner that we want to be. It's not just about selling services, but it's about, again, making difference and contributing to something bigger. And by extension, I think that starts to influence the broader public safety continuum and create a more trusting, transparent sector that we can work through. The one thing that I've really discovered since I've left government is that government is a highly complex organism, and when you think about the complexity of managing within that sector, within the public sector, I'm not sure everybody appreciates. You have a political aspect, you have stakeholder aspects, external stakeholders, including oversight bodies and things of that nature. You've got the organization itself, right? You have a commissioner and the union, and it's a highly complex place to work. And I've been able to take some of that thinking, I think, and bring it into the private sector. I never thought I would be able to do that. And so, within my organization, within Telio, I'm also hoping that, I can import some of that thinking and make our organization stronger, and optimize our opportunities, because I think there's a lot of opportunity to take some of that complex thinking managing within the government context into the private sector. I never thought that would be available to me. But I think it's a fascinating thing that's really just recently started to come to light to me, and looking forward to being able to contribute to, I have a job to do within Telio, but to maybe contribute to Telio being an even better place to work than it already is.
Simon, I absolutely love and appreciate your infinite mindset and the lens you bring to these issues. One thing that I bristle with as an evidence-based practice trainer is when a colleague or an administrator answers one of my queries by saying, well, Joe, we've always done it that way. and then my head explodes. Simon, I appreciate you being a part of the American Probation and Parole Association family and the great work you're doing. And I look forward to our future conversations, my friend.
No, and thanks for this opportunity. It's always great just to talk corrections and talk the opportunities, because there is so much opportunity in our space, and I think we're only limited by our imagination and our ability to execute on that. And again, coming into corrections, I would have never expected to have this kind of reaction and appreciation of the opportunity, and being able to talk to like-minded individuals like yourself about what we do and the difference we can make, and the greater difference we can make it's inspiring for me. And I just thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Simon. I always get to recharge my batteries talking to folks like you. Have a great weekend, and we'll talk soon. Bye-bye.
All right. Take care.
A big Criminologist podcast. Thank you to Simon Bonk, as well as our good friends at the American Probation and Parole Association, for giving us the opportunity to shine a light on a lot of the great work they do, both within their International Relations Committee and, as Simon alluded to, their Innovative Technology Committee. We will be back next week with a fresh episode. Looking forward to bringing you a panel discussion with Dr. Jared Brown and Timothy Joseph. Timothy is the host of his own podcast entitled Criminal Behaviorology. Going to have some fun playing around with a different format where I interview not one, but two guests in more of a panel format, if you will. Also very excited to tell you that we are going to continue with this collaboration with American Probation and Parole Association. And on January 14th of 2023, we will be joined by none other than Veronica Cunningham, Executive Director of the American Probation and Parole Association. So circle your calendars, January 14th, 2023. Veronica Cunningham will be joining us here on the Criminologist podcast. Back next week with a fresh episode. In the meantime, you may contact the show or reach out to us through our website, the Paragon Group, LLC.com, for training or presentations as to core correctional skills, implementation, program design, or, of course, the topic of desistance from crime. If you have questions or comments as to this podcast, feel free to contact the show via our email at thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. Remember to follow us through our Facebook and Instagram pages at The Criminologist Podcast. New, fun images are being added all the time to those feeds. You don't want to miss out. The Criminologist Media Group is also on Twitter. Give us a follow at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group. And you may also connect with me, Joseph Arvidsson, on LinkedIn, and follow both the Criminologist Podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. Hey, lastly, if you've not already done so, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for additional content as to the themes of this program. Merchandise is now available. Go to the Paragon Group, LLC.com, look for the tab entitled Shop, and you'll see all sorts of information on how you can secure your Criminologist coffee mug, refrigerator magnet, or pen for the office. And if you believe in what we're doing on the show, if you're part of the movement, please spread the word, tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us. Ask them to subscribe to the podcast. And of course, do so yourself if you've not already done so. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
But it was also, if there was a silver lining, at least in the correctional space, we were able to accelerate a whole bunch of stuff. and not just accelerate the implementation, but also demonstrate, what technology was capable of.
The Criminologist podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. If you enjoyed the show, you can find more content and videos on our YouTube channel, The Criminologist. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Both the Criminologist podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.